Welcome to the Dear Dyslexic Podcast, where lived experience meets real conversation. We shine a light on the stories that need to be heard, with honest and inspiring conversations with people with dyslexia and other neurodivergent conditions like dyscalculia, dysgraphia, ADHD, and autism. The Dear Dyslexic Podcast is more than just a show. It's a community, a space for connection, and a movement to rethink dyslexia. Subscribe today and join us on our journey, one story at a time. I'd love to go back to when you said you started tutoring your daughter in maths, because dyscalculia is so much more than just maths in a lot of ways that people don't understand. Are you able to unpack a little bit around some of the, because I guess, some people might think that some people often assume with dyslexia, the letters just move on the page or things like that. Are there common myths that you've heard around dyscalculia as well? Or assumptions?
I'm not sure. I actually think one of the issues with dyscalculia is that, like me, when I first heard of it, people have never heard of it. I think one of the issues is there's very little awareness of it. And even maths teachers that I've spoken to, hugely competent maths teachers, don't really have a huge, much of anything other than a basic understanding of it. And so I don't think that there's a lot of myths out there like there is about dyslexia. It's more that it's invisible and, it's misunderstood. Well, I don't even think it gets to the chance to be misunderstood because it's just a real lack of awareness of it. Certainly my experience with my daughter is that no one had ever heard of it. And so whenever she had a new teacher, it was always the whole, here we go, introducing a new teacher to it again. So I'm not sure that there are that many myths around it. I think that there are a lot of reasons for it. So maths is really difficult for a lot of people. So a lot of people living with dyslexia find maths difficult. And a lot of people with learning difficulties find maths difficult because it relies so much on working memory and processing speed. And so, I've tutored students that don't have any kind of formal identification, but they have slow processing speed or a limited working memory. And so they probably wouldn't meet the criteria for dyscalculia, but maths is extremely difficult if you can't keep all those kind of digits in your head and do those calculations. So I think pure dyscalculia, if we're talking about dyscalculia, is a little bit different to that, in that, I work with kids that find maths difficult, and, you live with dyslexia, you find maths difficult because a lot of the language is difficult. But really with dyscalculia, it's a lack of basic number sense. It's like if you think about dyslexia and think, at the core of most dyslexia is like phonological difficulty, difficulty hearing those little sounds in words and being able to break them apart and work with them. Dyscalculia is like that, but with a sense for numbers. It's like you can't hear the sounds in dyslexia. You can't see the numerosity in things. You know what I mean? You just don't have an idea of bigger and smaller or how that works. So, for example, I would have a typical discussion with somebody living with dyscalculia, and it might be like, okay, what's 12 plus 2? And they'll go, 122, because you add another 2 on and now it's 122. And you go, no, not quite. So I get out 12 counters and I'll add 2 more counters and I'll count out 13, 14. And I'll go, so 12 plus 2 is 14. What's 12 plus 2? 6. It's like, the concept just doesn't exist for them, if they've never had any kind of remediation. So, it's a clumsy example, but it's like a real disconnect with numbers that I find with kids living with dyscalculia. Difficulty with picturing a number line in their head, thinking, is 10 bigger than 15 or smaller than 15? So those kind of really fundamental conceptual things they find difficult. And so you can imagine that if you don't have that number sense, then when you get to more difficult maths, that really conceptual stuff where you're just seeing digits, numbers on a page, it doesn't quite make sense. Just yesterday, I was working with a kid, that I've been with for a while, and we've talked about equals and what equals means. And, I wrote 4 equals 3 plus 1. And I was saying, is that true? And he was saying, no, it's not. Because he knows that equals means the same, but he was saying, but it's a 4 on this side, and it's a 3 and a 1. Did I say 3 plus 2? It's a 3 and a 1 on this side.
I had to think then.
That's working memory. It's a 3 and a 1 on this side. See, and so he knew equals means the same, but he just didn't have a concept of value. That 4 represents 4 things and 3 represents 3 things and 1 thing. And so then when I put the counters out, he was going, oh, right, really? Like he was surprised. And so, yes, it's that real lack of making that number sense connection that I find with kids living with dyscalculia, rather than kind of maths anxiety or working memory issues. You see a lot of people living with dyslexia or working memory issues or ADHD and executive function, following sequences and things like that are difficult. And there's a lot of that in maths, so that can make maths difficult. But dyscalculia is more of that, really difficult grasping of those fundamental concepts of bigger and smaller and, what 3 means. What is 3? What does it mean? A 3-ness of something or a 5? What does 5 actually mean? They find that difficult to grasp.
And so what about understanding the concept of time, like what the actual time is? And because when we talk about dyscalculia from some of the podcasts I've listened to, and there's that real struggle of understanding concept of time as well, which means then someone can possibly be late for something. Like, how do you see it impacting outside of just trying to understand those basic what 3 things plus 4 things means?
Time is a big one. That lack of a sense of time, and I'm not speaking scientifically here, just my experience and opinion, but I think they're related. I think, the idea of quantity and bigger and smaller, because time is, after all, just a measurement, isn't it? And so the idea of more time, less time is still that same kind of circuitry, isn't it? Of what's more and what's less. I know that, with my daughter, for example, you'd go to a room and you'd say, okay, we're leaving for school in 10 minutes. Put your shoes on. I'll be back in 5 minutes. And we got to go. And, I go to the kitchen, I come back and she's like got a movie on and she's put dress up on and she's dancing and having a little disco. And I was saying, oh, we're going to be late. And she was going, what? I thought I had plenty of time. Like, just zero concept of what 5 minutes meant. And so one of the things we used to do is talk in terms of more concrete things. And so we would say, I remember there's a show called Charlie and Lola that the kids watched, and they had fairly short, I think they were like, 5-minute episodes or something. And so we would say it's like 2 Charlie and Lola episodes. And so she had more of a concept of that, of like, okay, I have a feel for how much that is. And so for us, more kind of concrete things like that to link time to worked, rather than kind of that conceptual 5 minutes, 10 minutes. That's very difficult to comprehend it. And the other thing we had with her was, with both my kids, was like a morning routine in a little book, which later became like a big fun PowerPoint thing where they would just go page by page and, when this one was done, do the next task. But the problem again was time. And so not knowing how long to spend on those tasks. So I made a PowerPoint that had each task with a little visual timer on it. So they could see, by the time this gets to here, I need to have done this. And then it flicks over to the next one and the next one and, plays a little alarm if you're going over time. So kind of external supports like that around time were really useful when they were young. But I think that goes to show, doesn't it, that as you say, that lack of time, I think, again, this is just my theory, but I think that is around time being a measurement and difficulty understanding quantity, what's bigger, what's smaller. Yeah, so it has big impacts. There's a lot of maths in everyday life that you don't think of. And what's particularly difficult for people is often fractions are very difficult. And fractions are everywhere, aren't they? You talk about reading a clock, that's all fractions, isn't it? Half past, quarter past, or recipes. So there's a lot of maths in everything. And so when you live with dyscalculia and have kind of no concept of it, it's really difficult. And as you say, it goes beyond just 2 + 3 is 5. It has, day-to-day implications and impacts.
So, what are some of those that you've seen, like for your daughter or younger people, like younger, as in teenagers that you've worked with, that flow and effect for them trying to manage school, or if they're starting like part-time work? Because even now,
Yeah.
like we're not seeing cash as often anymore. It's all tap and go. I guess maybe that's a good thing for people with dyscalculia. I don't know, but when that flow and effect, as you start to transition into becoming a young adult, what do you tend to see as some of the tripping hazards for young people as well that you work with?
Yeah. I think money is a big one. Money and percentages and discounts, because they are throughout everything, aren't they?
Yes.
When you're shopping, how do you know value? Because we know that shops try and trick us, don't they? They make something cheaper, but it's in a smaller package. And so being able to work out what's the best value is quite tricky and a really good life skill. Even things, as you're getting older, like loans and credit cards and what interests mean, they can have lifelong impacts, can't they? If you don't understand those basics of finances. And it would be very easy to take advantage of people that don't understand that. I mean, in regards to money, I think it's I don't want to say a bad thing, but I think it makes it harder not having cash, because I find, I do work with kids with money, and I've got a whole lot of real money and some play money, and most of them kind of react like they have not seen money before. Like they just don't really deal with it. And I think part of the work that I do with kids living with dyscalculia that works best is to make things concrete for them. So it's very difficult just to have abstract maths concepts and not tie them to anything in the real world. And so if money is only ever kind of digits and doodles on a page, it doesn't have any real meaning. And so having coins and notes and doing a lot of work, we play shops, and, I teach them the shopkeeper's method of working out change. And, so I give them a whole lot of products, and I come in and I buy stuff, and we practice that. And it's actually really difficult for them. And so having practical methods and practice, lots and lots of practice and repetition to do those things I think it's a vital step to actually work with the physical objects and see how it works, rather than it just all be electronic. Because it's so easy to spend money, make a mistake because you thought you were spending $27, but really it was $270.
Yes, as a dyslexic, it's very easy to do.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think having those skills are important. I think money and fractions, a lot of that is to do with the concept of value, which I think people living with dyscalculia find particularly difficult. So when I'm working with kids and adults, I talk about what we use numbers for. So I start with, what are numbers? I mean, have you ever thought about it? What are they?
Are there an arbitrary concept like Like how we just randomly called a cup a cup.
Yeah, but do they exist? Like, you don't go for a walk in the forest and see numbers. And so, like, what are they? And so, like, I literally start from there, because I think you really have to build up your understanding of numbers and what they are to get that number sense. And I think if you think about it, in terms of dyslexia, which is more familiar, there are many people that would learn to read without really being taught. You know what I mean? You can just kind of pick it up because you get enough exposure, and, those lucky people, it's about 30% of people can learn to read just because it comes easily for them. But then if you live with dyslexia or dysgraphia, you have to be explicitly taught how it works, because your brain doesn't pick up on those patterns naturally. And so you have to go very fine grain, explicit instruction on, here's how language works, here's how you spell, here's how you write, and break it right down into those fine points. And the reason why reading and spelling is so difficult is when you live with dyslexia or dysgraphia, you're always having to consciously do that while you're reading or spelling. You can't kind of let your subconscious look after it and think about what think more of the story you're writing and just let your hand do the writing. You've got to stop and think, how do I spell this, which kind of interrupts. So if you think about that in terms of maths and numbers, you really have to build up explicitly this understanding of what numbers are, what we use them for, and the fact that, for example, we use numbers for 4 things. And that's a little bit confusing for kids, because we usually just talk about numbers in terms of counting, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you think that's numbers. But we use numbers for counting, for measuring things. And so, but that's different to counting, isn't it? So you can have one thing that's 12 centimeters and one thing that's 24 centimeters. That's not really counting, that's measuring, or measuring time. So that's a whole new concept, isn't it? That's different to counting. Count, measurement, value is really tricky with numbers, because we say something has value and we use numbers to assign value. So in that case, we're not counting anything, we're not measuring anything, we're just arbitrarily saying that that coin is worth 2 and this one's worth 5. It has nothing to do with how much it weighs or how many you've got. So that's a whole other way to think about numbers. And then we use numbers for position to define the position of things. That's how GPS works. That's how graphs and everything work. So I kind of break it down very explicitly like that. And we look at those individual things that we use numbers for, because I think if you're not explicitly shown this very complex system, then you can see how it is very difficult to understand, isn't it? And particularly in terms of value, because our whole number system is based on value, because we have 10 digits, like digit 1, digit 2, and this digit 1 could be worth 1, or it could be worth 10, or it could be worth 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000, depending on where it is. See, this is so confusing. No, this is very complicated, isn't it? And so if you're someone that doesn't just intuitively understand that whole system of numbers and how it works, then you really need to be kind of walked through that explicit story and scaffolding all along the way. So just, it might take kids years, to start coming to terms with these concepts, and a lot of physical manipulation of things. And so I think that kids living with dyscalculia really need to see physical representation of things before we look at pictures of things or text descriptions. Count, measure, value, position. And so I think breaking things down explicitly like that is really important, because you can't expect a kid who doesn't have a concept of numbers to be able to go from counting to understanding value of something, or or measurements, or volume and capacity. It's also complicated conceptually if you don't have just that natural ability to understand it. And so, yeah, it's a matter of, working slowly, carefully, explicitly, building one concept onto the next, and getting that feeling of success, and really making sure that they understand things from a physical perspective before you try and make it conceptual or like a word problem or something like that. So,
Yes, and as you were talking, even though I don't have dyscalculia, I really struggle with maths. And I just kept thinking, I wish I'd had you as a tutor when I was younger, because I had lots of maths tutors. And I remember in year seven, the maths teacher, she'd get everyone set up in class and then she'd spend the whole session with me. And I was really lucky that she did that, because once you brought in the fractions and the language, and where the decimal place goes, I'm completely lost. So I was thinking this that whole time. If only someone had explained it like that to me, maybe I would have grasped it, because you need that, I think, even as a dyslexic to then help you conceptualize. So then when you start to bring in the language, which makes it even more complicated, you have that foundations, because once you get older, financial literacy, you're not set up properly.
yeah, that's right. And money's really hard. Rounding money, rounding coins is difficult. Understanding the value of $1 compared to a cent. It's 100 times more, but it doesn't feel like that. 30 cents doesn't feel that different to $3 if you're just looking at it as numbers. It's just an extra zero, isn't it? And so that doesn't give you a sense of how much bigger it is. Um, and so, yeah, I think getting that really hands-on sense of numbers. I do lots of estimation because that's a skill you need.
It
And
is.
anxiety comes into it too, doesn't it? Because if you know that you struggle with maths, even if it's not dyscalculia, it's that anxiety. And as soon as you're anxious, your working memory goes out the window and you can't think straight. And so, when you mention contracts and things to sign, that's one of my difficulties as well. Filling in forms. As soon as that happens, my head just goes like I'm a space cadet. Like I just can't think straight. And it really takes a lot of effort to kind of calm myself down and think, okay, let's just take this one little piece at a time. And I think if you think of that, for adults as well as kids in the classroom, if you're in that state of mind, maths is probably the hardest thing to do, isn't it? Because it relies so much on that working memory and being able to translate those kind of conceptual things into a physical reality.
And I think, how do you work with your students? Because I think if we've always struggled with maths, like I always say, oh, I'm so bad with money. And so I'm really trying hard this year in particular, as the business grows, that I can't. Well, one, you just can't be bad with money as an adult, because it
Yeah,
creates a lot of risk for us. But it's
yeah,
around, how can we change our mindset from a young age to help children say, okay, you might be struggling, but doesn't mean you're going to be bad at this for your whole life, or you're going to have really good strategies to help you, so you don't have this negative self-concept around money and numbers. And like, are there things that we can do from a young age to help us not feel like, because then it's kind of ingrained, isn't it?
yeah, it
I'm always
is.
bad with money. I'm never going to be able to manage a budget. I'm always going to order extra food, and that's just life. Like,
Yeah.
what can we do to help that?
Well, I think that kind of thinking is protective, isn't it? Because it comes from years of making mistakes. And so if you've gone to school and you just don't get it, despite, everyone's best efforts, then you kind of default to that state of, I'm never going to get it. And it sounds empty, I think, to try and override that by just saying, oh, it'll be okay. You know what I mean? It'll be okay. I'm sure you've probably heard 10,000 times, but that doesn't reassure you. So I find that actually getting success is the best way to start building confidence. And you get success by simplifying things to the level where the student, whether that's an adult or a kid, can understand it. You've got to start at the level of the learner. And often with kids with dyscalculia or, even just dyslexia and maths, that means going right back to the start. And, before we were talking about starting with what are numbers and how do they work and, those kind of fundamental understandings. If you don't have those, then it's very unlikely that you're going to get success with something like fractions, which relies on a huge amount of background knowledge for it to make sense. And so I find that it doesn't take much for students to start feeling like this is possible when they start succeeding. And so, and sometimes it's hard for them, but, there have been many occasions where kids have said, I'm never going to be able to do this. And we'll do something and they'll go, well, that was too easy. And I go, well, actually, you know what? Learning doesn't actually have to be hard. You can learn stuff, and if you're learning at your pace, it can always feel easy. And you're learning. And so sometimes I think because learning is so difficult, particularly kind of traditional learning, I think kids often get into that space of like, unless it's really hard and then I overcome it, I'm not learning anything. Whereas I try and, at least initially, while I'm building resilience and trying to change that mindset to something positive, I deliberately make it such small, fine-grained steps that it doesn't really feel like anything difficult has come along, because you're just building little bit by little bit. And a lot of that is just practice. So for example, even when I work with adults, there are some basic things that make maths much easier. So if we think about, just building up the concept slowly, bit by bit, well, then there are some skills that make maths easier to do in your head. There are skills and strategies that people who are good at maths just naturally do them, but people who find maths difficult really need those kind of strategies explained to them. So one of them is called number bonds. And so I start off with number bonds to 5, which is just what numbers add up to 5. So it's 5 and 0, 4 and 1, 3 and 2, 2 and 3, 1 and 4, 0 and 5. And so we practice those until they're just automatic. And we practice them by playing lots of games and, a whole variety of things, so that those kind of things just become automatic. And we do the same with number bonds to 10, so 5 and 5, 6 and 4, 7 and 3, 8 and 2, and build those as automatic. I work with kids on counting in twos. Sometimes with kids, we just start with counting in ones. Just counting up to 10 and back can be a challenge, but we just practice it and practice it and practice it. And they feel the success. So even if we're talking about something like, and this is, very recent for me with a kid I'm working with, he was thrilled because he could count to 10 and back. And he realized now that because he loves Thunderbirds, he realized he could do the countdown now, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, like for the blast off. And that feels small, but for him, that's a really big win. And so things like that build confidence. And so then I explain, well, you know what? All of the rest of maths is no more difficult than that. It's just a new thing that you have to learn, and you practice it enough and you do it in small enough steps. And it doesn't feel like it's this insurmountable thing. Whereas if you have, very little background knowledge, or there's some gaps in your knowledge, and then I try and teach you fractions, no matter what I do, it's going to be confusing for you if you can't reliably count. You know what I mean? Because or you can't kind of work out those really basic facts. And fractions rely a lot on multiplication and division. And so if you don't have those basic facts, then I'd be actually taking a step back from fractions and going, well, it's these basic skills we need to build first. It's like fluency. It's kind of like the alphabet of maths. We do counting in twos. So starting at 0 to 20 and back, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, up to 20 and back. And we also do that same thing starting at ones. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11 and backwards, which is really tricky for some kids.
You see
and for
my
quite
face.
a while, yeah, that's right.
I feel a bit of trauma coming in then when you said backwards.
Yeah.
I don't actually think I probably could, but it would take me time. I wouldn't be able
That's
to do
right.
it automatically.
Yes, correct.
And I probably wouldn't get it right the first few times.
That's right. But think of how many times you've got to do that when you're doing maths. You've got to count forwards and backwards all the time. And you're not always going to be lucky enough to be counting back from a even number. It might be 21, take 3, or 21, take 2. If you've got to stop and go 21, 20, 19, do it on your fingers, then you've kind of lost the thread of the sum that you're working on because you've kind of had to step out of it to do that small calculation.
Yeah.
But if you build up those fundamental skills so that they just become automatic, it frees up so much of your brain power to then be focusing more on, keeping track of the problem that you're working on or, whatever it is you're working on. But it also builds confidence. And so once you know you can do it, then you have the confidence. And for kids that struggle, I just let them read it to start with. So they have cards, when we do a new thing like counting in twos, forwards and backwards, I'll make a little card for them and they practice those cards as often as they can. And we practice them in every session. And if they're struggling with it, I don't put them under pressure because that's going to make their working memory go out the window. And then, you can see that whole spiral. It doesn't take very much for a kid to be suddenly saying, oh, I'm so dumb. Why can't I remember this? And so I kind of have to be on guard and know the kid as well. And just, say for the first 5 weeks, they just might be reading that forwards and backwards and not trying to do it off by heart. And where I might stop, where I might swap over to them doing it is usually them. It's usually them that says, okay, I want to try this without the card. And I think, this is gold. This is jackpot because now they're actually challenging themselves, which says to me, their confidence is up. They're not going to feel humiliated or stupid if they get it wrong. So they're kind of building up that little bit of resilience. And so I think just doing that in a really gentle, patient, caring way, not rushing them, letting them know that I understand how hard it is, that there are plenty of other kids that struggle as well. So it's always just, for me, about de-escalating the situation, making it feel achievable, making it feel like, that it's not a pass or fail situation. It isn't right or wrong. It's just a matter of practice and building up skills, I often say, think of kids play sport. I think, if you're playing basketball, you don't just go straight into a game and you're really good at it. You've got to spend hours and hours shooting hoops. And then when you get into a game, you're still going to miss them. It's like that. You just got to do the practice. And once you have the practice, then it frees up all that brain power to be then focusing on what the actual maths problem is, rather than just getting stuck in that calculation. And, I often see kids counting on their fingers and hiding their hands. And I say, you're counting on your fingers? And they say, oh, no, I'm not. Because at school, they get into trouble. If the teachers say, oh, don't count on your fingers, don't count on your fingers. And so they've got no other strategy. So they kind of put their arms under their hands under their arms or sit on their hands and try and count with their fingers. But I say, hey, whatever works. Like if you're using your fingers, bring them out. Let's talk about it. Let's start using them because eventually you won't need to use them anymore. But it's okay to use those as a step in between. So I think it's just, this is a big, long answer, but I think your question about how do you change attitudes and build confidence, I really don't think just talk can do it. They've got to actually feel success. They've got to actually go, you know what? I didn't understand fractions at the start of this year, and now I do. And once a kid has experienced that, then I think it opens up so many more possibilities. Then they become much more open to tackle things because they've felt that success.
If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we are doing at Rethink Dyslexia. So head to rethinkdyslexia.com.au. And don't forget, if there's anything you heard today that was distressing, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Thanks for listening and bye for now.